Today, I wanted to talk about the combat system of Mass Effect 3 and if it's good. People say a lot of things, like Mass Effect 3 combat is the best combat in the series, it's frustrating and awful. How do we find the objective truth? By defining our terms and shedding personal biases. I define good the same way as I did when dissecting the combat mechanics of the other Mass Effect games. A combat system that's good is consistently entertaining, i.e. fun. Fun, for me and many others, derive from whether or not you have a satisfying feedback and combat loop, and is usually compounded by a good skill ceiling, reasonable learning curve, and depth in combat. I will address each of these 4 points throughout the video. First, thank you for clicking. Let's, in the spirit of honesty, get my bias out of the way right away. I think Mass Effect 3's combat system is peak Mass Effect combat. Yes, even better than Mass Effect Andromeda's system, even though some say that that game had the best combat in the franchise. The reason why I prefer Mass Effect 3 instead of Andromeda's combat is the more realistic and tactical feeling of being on the ground without too many jets and superpowers. I like Gears of War a lot, as some of you might know. That said, I still think we can identify some objective elements, despite our biases, in our review. First off, let's talk about feedback and combat loop. With this, I mean how the game responds to your actions. Mass Effect 3 is a smooth, polished AAA experience in combat. You have more movement options than ever before, but not so much that immersiveness is drastically impacted. You can roll, run, leap and dodge, making Mass Effect 3 the most fleshed out cover shooter of the Mass Effect games to date, seeing as Andromeda basically a lot of times turn into Anthem. In Mass Effect 3 you get satisfying headshots and clear feedback from biotic auras, fire and gore. The feedback is exceptionally good. I'll say the same about the combat loop. The loop is short and sweet, with lots of satisfying sound and visual cues. A lot of ways to approach enemy types and encounters make it a very effective combat loop, which seems to be the majority opinion as well. Even though Mass Effect 3 is a cover shooter though, you aren't punished to death the instant you leave it, like one can feel in Mass Effect 2 when you're going from cover to cover. BioWare innovates further by making melee combat a more integral part of the experience. Each class has their own unique so-called heavy melee ability, and there are introduced more weapon mods and gameplay tactics like grabbing to utilize melee better. Especially in multiplayer with different races with different powers, melee can become a go-to way of approaching combat and no longer simply a last resort, as in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 1. Skills have been expanded, allowing you and your teammates to rock more powers than in Mass Effect 2, and now you can combine powers to make things go boom. Furthermore, modifying weapons like in Mass Effect 1 is back, though more streamlined than in Mass Effect 1. Another drastic innovation is the introduction of the weight system, allowing Shepard to choose whatever weapon they want, unlike before where it was class locked, so long as Shepard is willing to trade off slower recharge time on powers, which are vital very often in Mass Effect combat. Secondly, we need to talk about the skill ceiling. Mass Effect 3 innovates heavily in the difficulty department as well, compared to Mass Effect 2. No longer can you just choose casual, normal, hard and insanity. You can now choose narrative as well. This effectively makes the game into a movie where you deal incredibly increased damage to all enemies. Combined with the new option to play the game in action or story style, you can turn the game into a pure combat-oriented game, basically, or a pure story-oriented game, which I always thought was neat, since Mass Effect kind of offers an experience for everyone, though the story interested crowd probably the most. I for one feel it is necessary improving myself to the inhabitants of Valhalla to always play on the toughest difficulty possible in Mass Effect, though except when recording. I feel that skill ceiling in Mass Effect 3 is good. I still try and become better, meaning that this game can keep you playing for 10 plus years. This brings me to the next point, that is the learning curve of Mass Effect 3. It's fairly simple, especially with more comfortable difficulties to get good at the game. You can still freeze time using the power wheel like in the older games if you need a breather in game. Though there is a bit more movement, it's really not a steep learning curve. However, if you play on Insanity difficulty or the mod Platinum difficulty for single player, early game is pretty rough, but that is expected as a holdout of Mass Effect 3's role-playing shooter roots. Especially on Grissom Academy on Insanity, I sometimes want to rip my hair out. But when choosing difficulties, you want them to be difficult, right? So I don't find it to be that unfair either. Though I reckon people have some differing opinions on this exact encounter. I do find the learning curve to be good in Mass Effect 3, and this leans into making the game more consistently fun. As for my final point regarding the depth of the combat, we need to analyze the different elements of Mass Effect 3 combat. Like Mass Effect 2 enemies can have standard unprotected health, then depletable armor, then rechargeable shields or barriers, each of these latter ones stronger and weaker against a certain type of attack type. As for the attack types, you have biotic, tech and combat, like always. These can be combined to wreak extra damage in combat. My favorite cheat combo is Inferno ammo on the assault rifle plus spamming custom shots with very little weight to nuke even the toughest enemies on Insanity in the span of 2 seconds. The enemy variety in Mass Effect 3 and how they interact with you I also think is the best in the series. In the previous games you usually just had melee creatures and infantry shooting at you with different damage dealing weapons. In Mass Effect 3 they really gave each enemy opportunity to shine. Let's take one faction, the faction Cerberus for example, though this applies to the other enemies as well, especially the Reapers. Cerberus soldiers are your standard infantry, weak and easy to manipulate with biotics, even on higher difficulties, so you can do whatever you want with them, which is fun. So they can just basically sometimes throw a lethal grenade at you to force you to move out of cover, which is also cool. They're basically the grunts from Halo. Halo, as we all know, has the GOAT of combat loops, in the OG games at least. Next you have Centurions who are shielded and will smokescreen you, forcing you to reapproach and rethink the combat scenario to establish better lines of sight. They're basically the leader elites from Halo. Then we have the Guardians with the shields, obviously akin to the shielded jackals from Halo, slowly approaching you, allowing you to strategize around the fact that they can only hurt you in close range, and that if you're good enough you can actually headshot them through that little slot in the shield and neutralize them from a distance, further encouraging you to think about what weapons you want to bring into a fight. We have snipers with lasers, phantom mini-bosses, and Atlas mechs changing the entire scenario with their power level. And that is only one of the 3 main factions in the game, not counting the Cat 6 rejects or collectors or anything like that from DLC and multiplayer only. Essentially, Mass Effect 3's enemy variety is big, and with satisfying opponents, fun to shoot at, fun to be shot at by. So are the different guns, everything from a spike thrower, grenade launcher to your standard rifles with bayonets. So are the armor configurations and weapon modifying configurations. This gives the combat good depth and compounds into all the other factors making a game consistently fun. The combat loop, feedback, skill ceiling and learning curve. You can tell BioWare were satisfied with coming up with their end product here, so much that they can confidently added a multiplayer mode for the first time based solely around this combat loop, as well as the Armax Arsenal Arena in single player, which is basically Horde mode from Gears of War or Firefight from Halo. In summation, I think that an overweight of positive objective factors indicate that Mass Effect 3's combat mechanics are good. What do you think though? Do you agree with my definition of fun and what makes combat good? Do you still think Mass Effect 3 combat isn't all that it's hyped up to be? This discussion is welcomed as it is one of my favorite games of all time, and I had serious problems actually dreaming about coming home from trips and such just to play Mass Effect 3 multiplayer. I'm not ashamed, even though I should be. I should be. Like if cool, dislike if cringe. Dr. Epic, signing out.